I went and saw The Green Knight a couple of nights ago with my wife, and that show sounds like it would be harmless and cute, and it's going to sound like I'm recommending it a little bit, but let me just say it's definitely a grown-up retelling of this medieval ordeal quest. And medieval literature is very, very different than what we have now in terms of how we think about heroes. I guess one thing that it has in common with the best hero stories that we read today is that the main character goes on a quest to fight the problems within them and overcome that, and then that equips them to be what they need to be to deal with the problems outside of them. And this Green Knight, the way the story is retold, it really leans into that medieval ordeal quest thing where the young person in need of growing morally, ethically, intellectually, and growing with their handiness with the sword and with the rules of chivalry, they have to face a series of little miniature side quests, and they got to overcome that stuff, and they got to learn something from each of them. They got to pass these tests, and then they're ready to accomplish the big thing or face the big thing. Now, there's a little bit of a twist on it in this story that I liked, but in this medieval, chivalric, ordeal-driven kind of narrative, you really get two levels of meaning. One way to interpret it is simply to say that each event that comes up, each harrowing little feat that has to be achieved by the main character is born directly out of the character flaws of that character. And it's like Providence or God is putting before this young aspiring knight each and every one of these problems because that's exactly the thing that the knight needs to grow in or to overcome. But another way to interpret this thing is that it's not about the knight at all. It's not about the main character at all. There's a grand overarching theme about humanity and about existence, and that's really the best way to read it. Now, in this movie, you get one glorious speech with Shakespearean quality delivery about the Green Knight and the notion of green in general, and they're using it as a metaphor for growth as well as death, for thriving as well as rot, and it's very thoughtful, very interesting. But more than you get the grand overarching theme, you get a character whose actions and flaws leads them to the next ordeal that they need to face. You could interpret it either way. And I realize I've just burned a couple minutes talking about The Green Knight. I really am not intending to give a movie review of this thing, though admittedly, I did think it was a really cool, very interesting show, though certainly a very adult retelling of this story or this style of story. But the point I'm trying to make is that in any story like this, you can go grand themes or you can interpret it all as a narrative flow that's rooted in the needs of the point of view character. Well, who's the point of view character of the book of Matthew? If it's Sunday school time, the correct answer is Jesus, because Jesus is the correct answer to everything when you're in Sunday school. But if we're reading this thing critically, I think we're in agreement that the point of view character is Peter. The point of view character is the disciples in general, but Peter's the spokesperson. We encounter the miracles and life and teaching of Jesus through his lenses. Peter goes and makes exactly the mistakes that you and I would make, and he makes all of them. So just in case you wouldn't have a weakness to that ordeal, you'd probably have a weakness to this ordeal over here. And so Peter is the knight on the quest who is being refined from without and from within as he is trying to understand this grander, truer thing in Jesus. And a key moment in this relationship and in this ordeal quest that Knight Peter is on happens at the end of chapter 19, with Peter seeing the rich young ruler get turned away and being like, how does this even work? We've left everything to follow you and go on this ordeal quest, Jesus. What then will there be for us? And Jesus says, well, I mean, for one, you're going to get to judge the 12 tribes of Israel. I mean, you're the new family of faith, and there's a bigger, truer, realer thing going on here. So that's really good. And then he continues in that answer, and Jesus pivots saying, and actually everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. Well, one interesting little side note in all of that is that Jesus starts by saying that this blessing is for Peter and the disciples, but then he pivots in verse 29 to say, and everyone. So if you are more of a high church type that's more into the notion of apostolic succession, that is authority being handed down from the earliest apostles right on down the line, you're probably going to fixate on verse 28 and be like, yeah, see, Peter has this unique role and Peter died in Rome and therefore Rome has authority. Or these other disciples had this unique role, and they died in this place or this place. Therefore, we have authority. If you aren't the high church type, you're probably going to fixate on verse 29 and really lean into that everyone word and be like, no, see, Jesus was expanding this to everyone. I really don't know what to do with that debate. It could be that both are true, and there's something really unique about the role that the disciples got to play, but also there's something very profound about the inheritance that all Christians who come after have to do with it as well. That isn't the point of the passage, though. That's a debate we've inflicted on it later. The point of the passage is Sir Peter is on a quest as a flawed character, and he's facing these ordeals, and he gets to the swamp of despair, and he cries out as he trudges through the swamp like Atreyu, "We've left everything to follow you. What then will there be for us?" And in this particular ordeal, Jesus takes on the role of the sage and teaches with a wise, cryptic story in order to respond to despairing Sir Peter's question. And it would seem that the answer is twofold. One, Sir Peter, you'll be taken care of because of the authority and the credibility of the king. Two, Sir Peter, I see what you've been hinting at. I see what the other guys have been hinting at about pecking order and comparing with each other, and it's the wrong question. The values of my kingdom, says the great king to Sir Peter, are upside down, and many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. Then we get this whole parable about when people get hired and what the pecking order is going to be there. And then we run to the very end of the whole thing, and he says almost the exact same phrase, just the other way around at the end of the parable. The king says again to Sir Peter to conclude this ordeal, so the last will be first, and the first will be last. I'm about to say the word tomorrow, but don't take that to mean that we're done, because we're not. Tomorrow, we are going to break down all the different things that people have done with this passage over the years. Smart people, good people, people with good reasons to think what they think. But this one's a little bit open-ended because we don't get a next passage where it's like, and then Sir Peter came to Jesus and was like, hey, well, what's the deal with the whole parable about who shows up when and how that all works? And then Jesus said, well, it's like this and it's like that. We don't get the cipher for this one the way we get the cipher for other stuff. Instead, the only cipher we get here is that right before Jesus tells this parable, he reminds the disciples twice that he's going to die, and the disciples respond by despairing and then hinting at jockeying for position as to who goes where. Then the parable happens, and on the backside of the parable, Jesus again reiterates that he's going to die, and then the disciples begin to overtly jockey for position. So the two big ways to read this, just like you've got two big ways to read The Green Knight, are one, through the meta-narrative perspective. This is a grand theological point that explains many, many things about how time will unfold and what God will do with this people group or that people group, and who's getting judged and who's getting forgiven and which version of Christianity was ultimately right all along. That's one way to read it, the meta-narrative approach. The other way to read it is the point of view character approach. And look, you're smart. You can tell that the case that I'm making today is that the first and best way to interpret this passage is through the lenses of what's going on with Peter. Peter's attitude, Peter's questions, Peter's experiences, that is what prompts the response from Jesus. And then Peter and his buddies' experiences and their proclivities and insecurities right after the parable are what frames it on the other end. So Matthew chose editorially to bookend this thing that way. What that tells me is that if we go to this passage and ask one of the most important basic interpretive questions that we should always be asking, and you don't have to be the brilliant Bible scholar to ask this question, but that question is simply, why is this in the Bible? Because most things that Jesus did aren't in the Bible. Most things Jesus said aren't in the Bible. So if something's in there, there's probably a really dang good reason that it's there. And context, and especially the larger context, and thinking theologically and thinking narratively can help us get there. In this case, I say again, I am very confident that the first way to read this passage is in light of what's going on in Peter's mind and Peter's heart. Though Jesus doesn't pounce on him and correct him immediately like he does in some other moments, it's still abundantly clear that the reason this passage is in the Bible is in response to what Peter is going through, what he's feeling, this refining ordeal that he is wrestling through right here in front of our eyes. Peter, despite all he's seen, is still asking the wrong questions. Can't blame the guy. Every experience he had other than his encounters with Jesus reinforces the world kingdom values. It reinforces those thought habits, those assumptions about how things are. But now he encounters Jesus and it is upside down. The stuff that has value in the world doesn't have value in the kingdom. And that's weird and it's confusing. And aren't like life and death the most important, pressing questions of all? It's almost like Jesus is saying, no, there are bigger, even more pressing questions than that. So empathy again to my friend Sir Peter, my point of view character, Sir Peter. I am right there with you, man. Everything else I see in life reinforces not kingdom assumptions. And now I'm being challenged by these red letters here that I'm looking at in my Bible in front of me by kingdom assumptions. It's confusing. It's weird and it's difficult. And I would hope that even though we're 70% through this book, that I'd completely get it right now. And even though I went to school for this and I've been around it my whole life, that I completely get it right now, but I don't. It's hard, it's upside down, it's weird, and it's backwards. And so first and foremost, this passage, I think, is addressing those same things that you and I might be feeling as we are on this ordeal quest, encountering these difficult, otherworldly, transcendent teachings and priorities of Jesus. I like doing this thing with you every day. If you like doing this thing too, a couple of favors for you to consider. Yep, here's the whole list. If you haven't rated and reviewed the podcast, it's a huge help if you would. If you'd consider vouching for it even further by sharing it with somebody, that's the highest compliment you could pay, even higher than my third ask, which is, hey, if you like it and you enjoy it and you wanted to kick in a little bit on it, that would be awesome. You can do that at patreon.com/the TMBH Or you can also not, which is also completely cool. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. I'm Matt. This is the 10 Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.